It was the summer of 1985. The mountains were scorching hot, but at the foot of the ridge the air was cool, and in the caves, almost icy. It was there, into the system of underground passages, that a group of 5 speleologists set out. 2 experienced explorers, 2 enthusiastic students, and an instructor who knew the area better than anyone. Their goal was both simple and ambitious: to navigate the Western Passage, chart the route, and explore the legendary underground river. They set up camp at the cave entrance. Tents, food boxes, a radio, a route log. Everything looked like a typical expedition. A new entry appeared in the log. Entering the system. Objective: survey the Western Passage. No one suspected that this entry would be their last. Locals had long known about the river. They said that on damp days, its roar could be heard even by the road, and that deep within it were chambers where no one entered. The elders warned, the river sings, but its song is not for people. For speleologists, this sounded like a challenge. The instructor entered the cave first. He marked the lines with chalk, secured the ropes, and checked the ropes. Behind him came the expedition leader, carrying a notebook and a map. 2 students carried some of the equipment and chatted, trying to hide their nervousness. The second, more experienced climber brought up the rear, silent, focused, and always paying attention to detail. The air inside was damp and heavy. Water dripped from the ceiling, and every footstep echoed. They attached a vibration sensor to the first chamber and checked the connection. A voice from above responded. Acknowledged. Visibility stable. Everything was going according to plan. The path further on became more difficult. Narrow passages, low ceilings, water that sometimes disappeared into cracks, then reappeared. At one point, they emerged into a hall where a river flowed right under their feet, disappearing into the darkness. The noise was so loud that they had to shout. One of the students wrote in his notebook, "Hall with a river. The noise is getting louder. It seems the water is coming from somewhere deeper." They made a brief radio contact. "Everything is fine. We're moving forward." That was the last calm signal. Then things started to get strange. The sound of the water changed. It took on a rhythmic quality, as if someone were tapping out a signal. The silent, experienced one raised his hand, a stop sign. Everyone froze. The instructor turned off one of his lights to hear better. The sound continued for a few seconds, then disappeared. A dry note appeared in the notebook. In the Western Passage, the water began to rhythmically. A few minutes later, they found old marks on the wall. 3 scratches etched with a metal object. Not chalk, not paint, but deep matte. "These aren't ours," the instructor said. The leader took a photo. The students tried to crack a joke, but in the narrow passage, jokes crumble like dust. Soon a new sound was heard. Thin, steely, like a taut string. It came once and vanished. "Metal somewhere," said the silent one. "But there shouldn't be metal here. They logged it. Steel-tone pulse." The route then led to a narrow siphon. The rock narrowed the passage, and the water retreated, leaving a damp floor. They passed through one by one, leaving marks and a rope. Beyond the siphon, the air grew colder, and the sound of the water grew closer. They made a stop at the extension. They checked their flashlights, drank from the thermos, and wrote down the coordinates. The leader said, "We'll return in the evening. If we haven't left by dark, wait for the signal." It was a standard formula, always repeated. They made contact. "We're moving to the riverbed. Contact later." The reply from above was short. "I read." Those 2 words were the last the world heard from the group. Then came footsteps, stone, water, sound. They descended into the depths, leaving marks on the walls and phrases in a notebook. The cave accepted them evenly, without resistance. On the surface, the day grew warmer. The sun emerged from the clouds. Below, in the village, no one yet knew that in the evening people would wait at the entrance for voices, and that those voices would no longer come. The underground river continued to sing. Its song was so familiar that others would have found it indistinguishable from silence. But sometimes, if you listened long enough, a rhythm would emerge from the noise, an alien hand in a familiar dance. It sounded that day and then vanished. Perhaps it was then that history took a turn where neither maps nor rules go. When contact with the group was lost, no one at the camp at the cave entrance immediately panicked. Radio signals are often lost in the mountains. Rock muffles waves. Water distorts echoes, and even experienced expeditions are accustomed to short gaps. But by evening, the alarm became palpable. The log stated that the group was to return to the surface before dark. It was 9 o'clock. Night had already settled on the slope, and only the lanterns of the guards remained lit near the tents. The next day, rescuers arrived at the camp. There were 6 of them, with equipment and dogs. They descended into the first chambers, checked the markings on the walls, and found a vibration sensor attached. Everything looked as if the expedition had passed through just a few hours earlier. The ropes were taut, the small marks on the rock were fresh, even the boot prints had not yet been washed away by the moisture. But there were no people. In the hall where the river first appeared, rescuers found a notebook. On the last page was a note. In the Western Passage, the water gave rhythm. Then, a blank line. No date, no time. The notebook lay on a stone, as if it had been left there deliberately for someone to find. The dogs were behaving strangely. They calmly followed the route to the third chamber, but at the entrance to the Western Passage, they began whining and refused to go any further. Rescuers tried to pull them on their leashes, but the animals resisted, growled, and turned away. The report would later state, the dogs' behavior prevented further exploration of the Western Passage. Enjed's 2 days later, the search was expanded. New teams descended into the cave, set up searchlights, and began clearing the rubble. But the Western Passage proved impassable. The rock was crumbling, the water was rising, and every step threatened a collapse. The reports read dryly, further progress is impossible. Meanwhile, relatives were gathering on the surface. Wives and parents sat by their tents, awaiting news. In the village, they said they heard a strange rumble during the night, as if coming from the mountain itself. Someone claimed to have seen a light at the entrance to the cave, although the rescuers had already left by then. Newspapers wrote about the lost expedition. Photographers snapped pictures of tents, food boxes, and helmets neatly stacked at the entrance. The photos made it look as if the men had simply stepped away for a moment and were expected to return. But as the days passed, hope faded. A week later, the search was called off. The official report stated, a group of 5 people presumed killed in a collapse in the Western Passage. No bodies were found. For the relatives, this sounded like a death sentence without evidence. Legends began to emerge in the village. Some said that an underground river had carried the people into unknown depths. Others said they had found a new passage and traveled further than anyone before them. But the most common saying was, the river took them. Since then, the entrance to the cave has been closed. A metal grate was installed on the rock, and a no-entry sign was posted. But this didn't stop the rumors. On the contrary, the ban only intensified them, and everyone who passed by heard in the noise of the water not just an echo, but something more. As if in the depths, someone continued to knock, responding to a call. After the search ended, a peculiar silence fell over the village. It wasn't peace, but rather a tense anticipation, as if the mountain itself were listening to what people would say. And people did speak. Every evening, by the store, on benches outside houses, in kitchens over tea, they discussed the same thing. Where had the group of cavers gone? The official version, a collapse in the Western Passage, was unsatisfactory. No bodies were found, no equipment was discovered. Even the ropes secured in the first chambers looked as if they had been left the day before. For the residents, this was too similar to previous stories that had been whispered for decades. Older residents recalled that people had disappeared in these caves back in the 1970s. 2 geologists vanished back then, and the reports also listed collapse. But the villagers said something else. That night, they heard a roar like hammer blows, and that the river sang louder than usual. Thus, legends were born. Some claimed that the underground river was not just a flow of water, but a road leading somewhere deeper to other realms. Others said that voices could be heard in its roar, as if someone were calling their name. There were also those who swore that if you stood long enough at the entrance, you could see a light in the depths, as if a torch were burning there. Newspapers picked up on these stories. Words like anomaly, cursed cave, and voices from the water appeared in their articles. Journalists arrived, photographing the grated entrance, the overgrown paths, and the relatives' tents. The photos made everything look ordinary, but the texts transformed it into myth. For the families of the missing, it was torment. They wanted answers, but instead they received rumors. Wives came to the bars, leaving flowers and candles. Children asked, "When will Daddy be back?" And no one could answer. Meanwhile, the legends grew ever darker. Teenagers told each other that a devouring river lived in the cave, taking away those who strayed too close. Others speculated that the cavers had discovered an underground city where time passed differently, and that was why they had never returned. Rumors permeated everyday life. People began avoiding the path to the cave. Fishermen said the water in the river at the foot of the mountain had changed. It had become colder and heavier. Women claimed to hear echoes of footsteps in the roar of the wind at night. Thus, gradually, the official version faded, and in its place, a legend grew. The cave ceased to be simply a geological feature. It became a symbol of emptiness, mystery, and fear. And the more time passed, the more the legends took root. For some, it was a story of an unfortunate accident. For others, it was a place where the earth guards its secrets and does not let go of those who stray too close to its heart. But everyone agreed on one thing. After that expedition, the mountain was never the same. Almost 20 years had passed since the disappearance of the group of speleologists. The cave was officially closed, the entrance welded shut, and the case had long been listed in reports as archived. But memory in the village lived longer than paper. Every child knew. Beyond the mountain there was a river that sings, and it was better not to go there. In the early 2000s, interest in history resurfaced. A fashion for investigative documentary reporting had taken hold, and journalists were searching for forgotten secrets. The story of the underground river proved ideal, a disappearance without a trace, legends about voices in the water, and old archival footage. So a new group arrived in the village, 3 journalists, a cameraman, and a young geologist. They called themselves researchers, but in reality it was a mixture of enthusiasm and a thirst for sensation. The locals greeted them with caution. The elders shook their heads. It's not worth going there. The river doesn't like being disturbed. But the journalists were determined. They negotiated with the administration, received permission for a brief inspection, and headed to the welded sealed entrance. The bars were cut away. Behind them, a damp, iron-smelling air filled the air, colder than outside. They turned on the flashlights and entered. The first cells looked just like they had in the reports from 20 years earlier. Damp walls, traces of old markings, scraps of rope. Everything seemed untouched, as if time had stood still. In the hall where the river first appeared, they found what they were looking for. A rusty carabiner lay on a rock, and next to it was a piece of rope, cut cleanly, as if with a knife. The geologist said the rope couldn't have survived so long if it had lain there for 20 years. It looked fresh, as if it had been left there recently. They continued on, toward the western passage. The air was heavier there, the roar of the water louder. At one point, the operator paused. New scratches were visible on the wall. 3 short lines, cut with a sharp object, exactly the same as those described in the old reports. But these looked fresh. Deeper in, they found even more oddities. On the floor lay a sealed container. Inside was a notebook and a cassette tape. The paper was damp, but legible. The last entry in the notebook ended with the words, "The noise is getting louder. It seems to be calling." The tape was turned on once they reached the surface. The recording contained the sound of splashing water and a rhythmic, pounding sound. At times it seemed like voices, but the words were impossible to discern. The journalists returned to the village shaken. Their stories appeared in newspapers and on television. Headlines screamed, "The river speaks again. Traces of the lost expedition found." The tape recording was posted online, and thousands of people listened to it, debating whether it was simply the sound of water or something more. Officials remained silent once again. Their reports stated, "No evidence of anomalies detected." But for the villagers, this sounded like an admission of powerlessness. Since then, the river's legend has taken on a new life. It was now said that it remembers those it had claimed, and that the roar was their voices. Children drew helmets and ropes on the walls, and teenagers went to the entrance at night to hear the sound. Returning to the cave yielded no answers. It only brought new questions. But it was from that moment that history ceased to be the past. It became the present again. After the publication of materials about the return to the cave, interest in the story rekindled, but the real sensation was yet to come. A few months later, a small group of researchers, 2 geologists and a cameraman, arrived in the village. They wanted to verify the journalists' findings and also conduct their own measurements. They entered the first chambers without difficulty. Old markers, scraps of rope, damp walls, everything was in place. But in the western passage, behind a narrow siphon, a discovery awaited them that would change their perception of the entire story. A sealed plastic container lay on a rock. It was coated in a film, but the lid held tight. Inside were several sheets of paper and an audio cassette. The paper was damp but legible. The first few pages contained the usual notes: air temperature, water level, coordinates. But further on, the handwriting became uneven and the lines broke off. The final entry read, "The noise grows louder. It seems to be calling." The researchers listened to the tape back at the camp. The recording contained the sound of splashing water and a rhythmic pounding sound. At times it seemed like voices, but the words were indistinguishable. The sound was too steady, too persistent, as if someone or something was trying to transmit a signal. The discovery caused a storm. Newspapers reported, "Recordings of a lost expedition have been found." Articles quoted lines from the diary and published transcripts of the tape. Thousands of people listened to the recording online. Some claimed to hear words in the noise, others that it was simply the sound of the water playing. For the families of the missing, the evidence was a further blow. Some hoped that if the records had survived, it meant the men might have lived longer than previously thought. Others said it was proof the expedition had reached the very heart of the river and vanished there. Scientists debated. Some claimed the rhythmic sound was a natural effect of water flowing through narrow stone crevices. Others insisted it sounded too much like an artificial signal. In the village, the legends only grew stronger. Now they said the river remembered those it had taken, and that the tape was their voices. Children whispered to each other, "If you turn on the recording at night, you can hear them calling their names." Officials remained silent once again. Their reports stated, "The discovered materials do not contain credible evidence." But to the public, this sounded like an admission of powerlessness. And so the story took on a new chapter. It was no longer just a tragedy or a legend. It was a mystery, confirmed by evidence, impossible to fully explain. When the second expedition left the cave, it seemed history would finally have answers. But instead of clarity, only silence remained. The tape recordings, the diary with fragments of phrases, the fresh scratches on the walls. None of this explained anything, but only deepened the mystery. Officials quickly closed the matter. The reports stated, "The discovered materials do not contain credible evidence. Further research is inadvisable." The entrance was once again sealed with bars, and a no-entry sign was posted. But everyone understood. Prohibitions would not stop those seeking the secret. Life in the village went on as usual, but the memory of the river lingered. On the anniversary of the disappearance, families gathered at the foot of the mountain, lit candles, and brought photographs. The children, who had grown up without fathers, now worked in other businesses, but each of them knew their lives had changed the day the river claimed 5 of them. The rumors continued. Some said the rumble could still be heard if you approached the grating at night. Others claimed to have seen a light in the depths, even though the entrance was blocked. For some, these were mere horror stories. For others, proof that the story wasn't over. The journalists returned to the topic several more times, but each news story ended the same way. No answers. Archival documents, eyewitness accounts, and tape recordings all formed a mosaic, but a key piece was missing. The cave gradually became a symbol. For some, a symbol of loss. For others, a symbol of mystery. It stood on the outskirts of the village, overgrown with grass, forgotten, but everyone who passed by felt its presence. It was this presence that became the final chapter of the story. Not the found bodies, not the official reports, not the recordings of the hum, but the emptiness left behind by the people, an emptiness that oppressed more than any sound.
The underground river continued to sing.
But now its song sounded different, not like the sound of water, but like a reminder that there are places where a person remains only a guest, and sometimes these places decide that the guests must leave.